was here 2 seconds ago. My brother, Adebola Reese, who are here with us today, and also all of you who are in the audience, you are all very much appreciated. And those of you who are in the Zoom audience, you are not forgotten. You are very much appreciated. Thank you so much. So I'm going to share my screen now because I have a bit of a visual presentation for you all. So just give me 2 seconds. Okay. For years, I've been researching the history of migration to Lagos in the 19th century and the migrant communities that emerged from that history. And this research has taken me to various places in West Africa and various places in the world in search of records. This, while it has been an interesting and fun research process, it has also raised a nagging question. Where is Lagos in the search for records on its own 19th century history? How can Lagosians play a more intentional role in the creation and preservation of records concerning Lagos history? As individuals, as human beings, we are constantly creating records of our presence in this world, whether we're doing so consciously or unconsciously, on our emails, etc. We as individuals leave records of our time on this earth. Our events leave records of their occurrence. Our communities leave records of having been here. For me, researching records is a matter of being curious about what kinds of records were left and how they might be uncovered, not whether they are records at all. This talk is going to focus on the record of one particular person's experience of migration from Brazil to Lagos at the end of the 19th century. When we talk about 19th century returnees in Lagos, we generally focus on their lives once they arrived to Lagos. Of course, this makes a certain kind of sense, but in my research, I'm also interested in the journey that they took to get here, which was its own thing, its own history, its own fate. And especially, since journeys are fundamental to a full understanding of anything related to migration. The story we have gathered to hear today concerns the migration of a woman named Romana. At various times in her life, she was known as Romana da Conceição, and then Romana da Conceição Martins, but always Romana, and that's what I'll call her. What I'm going to do in the talk is to explore Romana's story of migration through 6 different records and talk about these various kinds of records and how they speak to each other and how Lagos records can figure more fully into these kinds of history. The 6 records I'll be sharing are Romana's obituary, newspaper accounts from Lagos, photographs related to the history of 19th century migrations, a routine report of a Catholic missionary to his superiors in France, the transcripts of an oral interview that was conducted with Romana, and a novel some of you might be familiar with that was written by a Brazilian author, and in my view, inspired by the life of Romana. You'll see that while the history is centered on Lagos, the records are dispersed and coming from various places. I will conclude with talking about a digital initiative of mine, the ecopolitanproject.org, that some of you may have seen, that seeks to encourage Lagosians, what I call the Lagos diaspora, to participate in creating and preserving records on Lagos's 19th century history. I think I found the guilty factor.
Okay.
I'm muting.
Okay.
Muting people one by one. An obituary for the real Romana. Romana da Conceição was born somewhere in Brazil in the late 19th century. According to her obituary in 1892. That year was not in and of itself a very significant year in the history of either Lagos or Brazil, but it followed 1888, which was a significant year indeed. In 1888, the Brazilian Empire finally closed the chapter on 500 years of human slavery with the passage of the Lei Áurea, also known as the Golden Law. And it was adopted through the pen of Princess Isabel de Bragança. The Golden Law pronounced the legal category of slave extinct in Brazil, which meant that slavery became uniformly legally abolished in the Brazilian Empire. From 1888, therefore, everyone in Brazil was a free person, regardless of their descent, origin, or their previous status. And this was the state of the empire that Romana was born into. Romana was known to have had two siblings, a mother and a grandmother. This was according to a life history that she related later in her life. She, her mother, her brother, her sister, and most importantly, perhaps, her grandmother, all made that journey from Brazil to Lagos in 1899. I said that Romana was born as a free person in Brazil following the passage of the Lei Áurea. Her grandmother, however, had lived the greater part of her life as an enslaved woman in Brazil. At this point, I did not know much about Romana's mother, who was in the middle generation, but I do know that Romana's grandmother was a person who lived a remarkable life. As a girl, she was one of tens of thousands of young people who were ensnared in the peculiar 19th century phase of the Atlantic slave trade. Some of you might not know why it is considered a bit peculiar, but we can get into that. Romana's grandmother had been kidnapped as a child from Edba country around the 1840s, possibly even from Abosede, which was just coming into being. And she had been sold to Brazilian merchants in Lagos, who had taken her away to their land. I imagined that she had been dreaming of escape all of her life. What we do know for sure is that she found a way in her lifetime to take herself and her family out of the land of her bondage. This talk is titled Romana's Return, but it is perhaps more accurate to view the matriarch that arrived to Lagos in 1899, carrying half a century of exile behind her and her small family in tow, as being properly what scholars refer to as a retornado, a returned person. We should really be talking about Romana's grandmother's return, and yet I cannot at this point. Not much, not yet, not with the records that are available. So we'll talk about Romana. The ship. At some point in June 1899, or maybe in the first week of July, a ship called the Aliança arrived at a Lagos that was in the throes of a disease panic, with fewer passengers on board than it had departed with from Bahia. The ship might have looked something like this one, and this is not the Aliança in question, as far as I know, but it might have looked something like this one. The Aliança had been plying the Lagos-Bahia route for several years. Through a digital archive that my university library subscribes to, called the African Historical Newspapers, I've seen an announcement of the ship's arrival to Lagos in the Lagos Standard newspaper, dated December 4, 1895. And 2.5 months later, on February 19, 1896, the ship departed from Lagos with 48 passengers on board. That too was announced in the newspapers, and this was a normal thing. So I know from these records that the Aliança had been traveling between Lagos and Bahia for some time. It regularly ferried tobacco, cachaça, and carne de sul to Lagos, and Kolanos, Ashoke, and Atare to Bahia. Besides those necessities and other cargo, the ship also seems to have specialized in ferrying Liberto or Emancipado or Retornado passengers and their frequent descendants back and forth across the Atlantic. That July of 1899, the Alianza arrived to Lagos as usual. 5 of the passengers it was carrying were the young Romana de Conceição, her mother, her grandmother, and her 2 siblings. This is a picture of a group of passengers on a ship coming from Bahia to Lagos. And I found it in an archive in Washington, D.C. called the Anacostia Community Museum, Anacostia Community Museum Archive, in the collection of a scholar named Lorenzo Dow Turner. The Anacostia Museum is a small local museum, but is part of the Smithsonian Museum system. And Lorenzo Dow Turner was an African-American linguist, anthropologist, and pioneering scholar of African and African diaspora studies. For all of his career, starting in the 1920s, he researched African retentions in the Black cultures of the Americas. And by 1972, coincidentally, when he died, he had amassed a tremendous collection of records, including audio, visual materials, recordings, documentary records from North America, South America, and from West Africa. And many of the images that I found there are helpful for me to think and to try to imagine the people that I'm talking about, even if they're not exactly those persons. Luckily for us as researchers, his widow, Lois Turner Williams, donated his collections to the Anacostia Museum in 2010. So this is not a picture of Romana, but this is the picture that comes from his collection that he got either in Brazil or in West Africa. And the caption that he wrote on the back was, "En route to Lagos from Bahia, period, after the abolition of slavery, period." Some of them were born in Brazil and some in Africa, period. He collected that around 1940, 1950. Even though it is not a picture of Romana, the girl in the picture or the young woman in the picture helps me to think about her. It does something very powerful as a record, given how few photos exist globally of 19th century Africans and of Black migrants coming to Africa. Let us take a moment to digest the fact that 123 years ago this month, July 1899, Romana Conceição and her family were landing just down the road from where we sit right now at the marina. When the ship arrived, rumors had been circulating that there was a plague in the nearby French West African port of Grand-Bassam, which is the Ivory Coast, and also that there was yellow fever epidemics in Brazil. Considering these perils, layered on top of the usual illnesses that haunted the nightmares of European visitors in West Africa, the British authorities determined that the Alianza had departed Bahia with a quote-unquote foul bill of health, and therefore its passengers could not be allowed to disembark. Of course, we are in the time of COVID, and I bring up the issue of disease epidemics to highlight the fact that there were many factors that could impact return to West Africa, and this was one of them. Just as our yellow cards and our COVID cards today regulate how we can travel, so did fear of disease in the 19th century, perhaps more intensely in fact. So we have to keep in mind that the British fear of coastal West African illnesses strongly shaped the quality of arrival for late 19th century migrants and returnees. Mysterious deadly fevers with more names than possible varieties seem to strike at every turn, leaving scores of European corpses. And less remarked, also scores of African babies' corpses as well, in their wake. The prevailing theories about the deadly fever-inducing illnesses of the coast of West Africa held that they could somehow be physically contained and kept out of the European areas and out of European waters. As such, strategies ranging from imposing residential segregation between the races to try to block the airflow from the nearby sick towns were experimented with in hopes of preserving the health of the European population. New arrivals to Lagos were therefore considered pathogenically suspicious until proven otherwise, and they were treated accordingly. So for weeks, and I want to thank the artist Olatido Aderemi for helping me with my images. For weeks, the Alianza sat in the water or on the roads, which is apparently a maritime phrase, just sat anchored. The ship sat on the roads while its captain, the newly appointed quarantine officer, and the mixed African and European members of the Legislative Council debated on the reasons why the ship could not disembark, but also the possible conditions under which it might be permitted, its passengers might be permitted to do so. An anonymous contributor to the July 8th issue of the Lagos Weekly Record newspaper tried to explain the key issues for their readers. Issue number 1 was that Lagos did not have any quarantine facilities for either ships or people. A related issue was that the British government in Lagos did not have any tested procedures for implementing a quarantine, only the ad hoc ones they were inventing in real time. A third issue was that Lagos was a small place at the turn of the century, where nasty things like fires, rumors, and illnesses could spread quickly through the town. The anonymous explainer seemed certain that the captain of the ship had known perfectly well that his ship was not medically sound, and that the passengers knew it too. Whether they all knew this at the beginning of the journey or by the end was irrelevant at that moment. Their simple knowledge of the fact meant that they, quote, ought to be prepared to make some sacrifices, end quote. The colonial officials tried to convince the ship's crew and passengers to leave, reportedly by furnishing them with enough water and food and medicines for a return journey. Then they ordered that they should leave the port and return to whence they had come, an order that the captain evidently refused. 70 persons, this was in the newspaper, let's call them anonymous. 70 persons, anonymous argued, cannot count as against 50,000. And yet it seems to the lay mind that there ought to be available a middle course of some sort, which if adopted would minimize the risk and the inconvenience involved. This is the July 8th issue of the Lagos Record. The risk was on the side of the colony and the inconvenience on the side of the ship's passengers. But there was a big moral question looming over the whole affair. The fundamental issue was that the core group of passengers on the Alianza were elderly Africans who had in their early years been ensnared in the Atlantic slave trade. They had spent the majority of their lives toiling in the Brazilian Empire. And now in their old age, they had been liberated from slavery, and they had found both opportunity and means to attempt a return to the places they had come from. Anonymous characterized them as, quote, elderly natives who have sold out at Bahia and come to Africa to die, and upon whom disappointment must act as effectively as the disease with which the ship is infected. To place these particular unfortunate native repatriates on a ship bound for Brazil, again, would represent nothing less than, quote, a violation of the principles of humanity. There's another source I've seen that spoke of an unnamed ship that arrived to Lagos from Brazil in 1899. I suspect that it was the same Alianza. The record was created by one Reverend J. Lang, a missionary with the French Catholic SMA, which translates to the Society for African Missions. And he He wrote a report on the SMA activities for the year 1899. SMA had established a foothold in Lagos since 1861. And although it was a French institution, most of the priests that they sent to Lagos were recruited in Ireland. Irish youths were preferred for service in Lagos due to their greater facility with English, the language of the emergent colonial power in the region. So I saw the record that Reverend Lang created in the town of Cork Island at an archive that houses, that is a kind of a group, an archive located in the group home for retired SMA priests. So in their group home, they have a library with an archive that you can go inside. Reverend Lang was based in Lagos in 1899, and he witnessed a crisis develop around a ship from Brazil, which ultimately created a new opportunity for the SMA. In the record that he created, Lang described the arrival of a ship with, quote, a certain number of natives who some 50, 60, or 70 years before had been taken to Brazil and sold this way. They were, in his words, pushed by a craving desire to see their African homes once more before dying. We get the picture now that landing in Lagos was not unconditionally guaranteed to returnees and migrants. There was no discourse of a right to return based on racial affinity, ethno-linguistic heritage, or history. Certainly, health status was a condition for permission to land. According to Reverend Lang's letter, when the ship arrived in Lagos with its cargo and passengers, the yellow fever was raging on the Ivory Coast, and the same was officially announced to rage in the Brazils. The government took the necessary precautions to put the ship in quarantine. The quarantine over, the state of health of the passengers on board was far from being satisfactory. A further quarantine was ordered. The ship and its passengers arrived in Lagos during the first year of William McGregor's 5-year term as governor. Some of you might be familiar with him. And McGregor went on to distinguish himself among colonial governors of Lagos for the ambitiousness and broad-mindedness of his anti-malaria campaigns, which included swamp drainage, well filling, and widespread distribution of quinine to Europeans and Africans alike. Regardless of McGregor's intentions or those of his predecessors, the effect of the state's policies for returning to Lagos was that they found that simple arrival, not to speak of the deeper experience of return, was burdened with alienating administrative complications. The ship's passengers were forced to wait at the metaphoric border of their homeland, unable to set foot on African soil, until a European official determined whether or not their bodies threatened the health of European colonists in Lagos. As they waited to decamp from their ship, in a 64-day journey, at the end of a 60+ years of exile and enslavement, turned into 65 days, 66 days, 76 days, 86 days, with no end in sight, temperatures began to run high. From Lang's telling, the passengers demanded permission to either land or to keep moving further south to a deserted spot if they were to be prohibited from immediately entering Lagos. The reference to a deserted spot where they might land in peace suggests a deep frustration with the sanitation policies of the British colonial state. It also suggests to me a misguided idea of what late 19th century Africa was like, perhaps born of their 6 to 8 decades of absence, that there might be a deserted spot on the West African coast that one could return to without being placed under the control of a European regime. Continuing with Reverend Lang's account of the events, he wrote, quote, after a few days, however, the doctor's report was better. The general health had improved thanks to the generous supply of fresh meat by the government. Clothes were collected for men and women from the whole town and sent on board. The sanitary inspector had them throw their clothes off and take the fresh supply as a condition of their being admitted on board a launch for further quarantine. Finally, the passengers being all well, they were allowed to enter the town. Take a round of applause after that. The passengers must have rejoiced mightily, as we all did just now. when they were finally allowed to enter Lagos. But their joy turned to despair as the reality of what it meant to be elderly, to be kinless, and to be recently freed ex-slave in Lagos quickly sunk in. For one thing, the ship they had arrived with was judged to be unsanitary and was ordered to return to Brazil with its contents. And this left the returnee passengers in Lagos without their belongings, and completely at the mercy of the people of Lagos for food, shelter, and care. The mysterious tropical fevers that haunted the nightmares of Europeans were, for the most part, racially impartial, and the passengers themselves were soon struck with shivers and cold sweats, what Lang referred to as the first acclimatizing fevers. Okay. It is not the European alone who has to pay his tribute to the murderous climate of the west coast of Africa, but the native also, when he has been away from his home for more than 10 or 15 years. Now, all of Lang's comments on this episode appeared as part of a letter that he wrote to praise his fellow SMA missionary, one Bishop Gillette, for establishing a refuge known as St. Glover's Home for destitute Catholics in Lagos. St. Glover's Home was inspired by people like the 1899 returnees, the Alianza passengers, who had only shared histories of enslavement and emancipation, shared religious affiliation with Catholicism, to bind them the more established residents of Lagos. In case, what is important to note here is that although Reverend Lang's record was most likely chronicling the arrival of the Alianza, he never actually named the ship. Lang's primary focus is on the SMA mission and lauding the work of SMA missionaries in Lagos. The people who were on the Alianza, some of whom ended up staying at the newly established St. Glover's Home, are characterized as an undifferentiated group. What we get is a single story about the passengers of the ship. We don't know if any of them are children, grandchildren, traders, sailors, pilgrims, students, or any of the other categories of Africans who came from Brazil to Lagos in the 19th century. None of them have names. Even the ship is unnamed. The passengers are rendered as either passive victims of the actions of others or mute beneficiaries of the largesse of the Catholic mission and its community. The process of returning was bound up with the changing geopolitics of the region. Although free from slavery in the Americas, returnees could find themselves in a new state of vulnerability in Lagos. Their histories of enslavement have severed them from local kinship networks and required them to create new familial lineages. Depending on when they arrived in Lagos, they held different political status and could expect different forms of support from the state. For example, if they arrived in the 1850s, or 1860s, when the British were actively trying to invite people to come to West Africa in order to create a buffer constituency between themselves and the Obas, and also to take up colonial agricultural schemes. They could expect more support from the state and more protection. But by the 1880s, 1890s, returnees were no longer a special kind of potential constituency for the colonial state. This meant that later returnees were not offered incentives to settle in Lagos, and they did not receive any special protection from the founding government. Some of the things they might have needed protection from were starvation, homelessness, and even re-enslavement. They survived on the sympathy of their compatriots. Their relationships to each other were grounded in shared history. Their shared histories of enslavement and emancipation in the Americas were culturally marked on them through things like naming, through their language, through their religions. The church played a significant role in cohering this ethnic community. Without the church, Brazilianness in Lagos lost a third of what gave it meaning and visibility. But also, without the returnees from Brazil, the Catholic Church lost its foothold in Lagos. Let's turn to another source on Romana's story. And this source was created by Romana Martins da Conceição, or Romana da Conceição Martins, 6 decades after the original event of arrival. In the late 1950s, she became acquainted with Pierre Berger, who's a French-Brazilian photographer, anthropologist who became a Babalao in West Africa. And he spent decades traveling between South America and West Africa on the trail of historical connections between the two regions, and also in the service of forging new connections as well. Through her friendship with Berger, she later met Antonio Olito, a Brazilian writer, scholar, and translator, who had been appointed as the cultural attaché to the Brazilian embassy in a newly independent Nigeria. The two of them became research collaborators in the early 1960s. Olito was fascinated to discover this history of Brazilians in Lagos, and Romana was, as the historian Paulina Alberto put it, plagued with a lifelong case of saudades for Brazil, like longing. Romana assisted Olinto with connections to the Brazilian descendant community in Lagos and facilitated interviews with its members and gave him at least one interview in Portuguese about her life in exile. So this is a group photo that Romana, you can see Olinto with Zabada and his wife, I think her name was Zora, and some of the other members of the União Descendente Brasileiros in Lagos.
So is she outlined in blue?
Yes, she is beautifully outlined in blue. In the appendix of one of his nonfiction books, Brasileiros na África, Olinto transcribed excerpts from his conversations with Romana about the circumstances of her passage to Lagos. From his notes, and this is him transcribing what Romana told him. We arrived here on September 7, 1900. On the high seas, we suffered hunger and thirst. The trip took 6 months. I remember a Hausa Muslim in Brazil. My sister Louisa played with the rocking of the ship without any fear. Not me, I was afraid. Our grandmother was always talking about how good it was to live in Africa. She had left Abeokuta very young and felt that there was no better place to live. When we arrived, everything was difficult. Fearing illness, the English took everything we had. We landed in Lagos, wrapped in clothes that were not ours. My grandmother cried when she saw that my mother, me, and my brothers, who were Brazilian, were not going to get used to it quickly here. People died on the trip, yes, of hunger, principally, and old people who couldn't stand the hardship of life. This transcription of Romana's account of the Alianza episode combined the trauma of the journey when she witnessed the death of a number of passengers, probably their bodies being tossed into the water, with the trauma of the non-arrival, when the exhausted passengers waited for weeks to be released from the ship onto the land. The ship, in her retelling, was all death. Death from thirst, from hunger, from illness, but most poignantly, what she called the hardship of life. Timelines were elasticated in Romana's memory. She spoke of a 6-month journey, and she spoke of arriving in September 1900. For the passengers on the Alianza to have finally disembarked in September 1900, the ship would have had to have been anchored in Lagos for a full year and a half. For the journey from Bahia to Lagos to have taken 6 months at the end of the 19th century would have been extremely extraordinary. It would have been triple the normal length of time. Was it actually that the entire Alianza episode took almost 2 years from beginning to end? Or was it more likely that for the young Romana, whose sense of dislocation went on to stretch through the rest of her life, the passage from Brazil to Lagos seemed to take forever? Now, Romana did finally find a solution to her saudades. Indeed, an important thing that came out of the relationship between Romana and Olinto is that he managed to organize a 3-month state visit to Brazil for Romana Martins da Conceição in the late 1960s. when she toured various cities and met with the press, and met with politicians, and met with relatives she had not seen since leaving Brazil as a child. This visit was the realization of a lifelong desire. She was reported to have said, "When I was 20 years old, I imagined that I could come to Brazil soon. At 30, I started to find this difficult. After 40, loss of hopes. When I turned 50, I thought I was close to death, and why think about the Brazil I would never see again? At 60 years old, I was already resigned, but only God could give me such a gift after I was 70, to see my land and my people again." This fascinating quote raises several questions for me. Was Romana's return in 1899, or was it 1969? What did it mean to be Black and Brazilian in the 19th century versus in the mid-20th century? What did it mean similarly or differently to cross over from Brazil to Lagos as part of a circular life journey versus doing so in a linear one-way manner? How did the 19th century migrants define their sense of home? Those are questions I explore in my larger work, but I will table them for now to focus on one last record of Romana's return. Romana and Antonio Olinto conducted a bunch of research, or a lot of research in Lagos. And out of their interactions, Olinto penned A Casa d'Agua in 1969, translated to The Water House in 1970. So he wrote it in Portuguese, and next year there was an English translation. Some of you might have seen this novel. And I think I've had this novel since I was in my late teens, early 20s, although I could never get through reading it until this year. It's a very funky style.
I think it's the translation.
Could be the translation, but it also could be a certain kind of Latin American writing. Well, it's written in an odd style, and it's also colored by a kind of luso-tropicalist lens that I was entirely unfamiliar with before becoming a historian. Now I get it, so now I can read it. To summarize the book for those who have not had the pleasure, the novel is described on the book's jacket as being about, quote, the pilgrimage of Mariana Silva, a Brazilian African girl who was born in the Black Slough found freedom. She is carried by her grandmother through a nightmarish 6-month journey from Brazil to her family's ancestral home. Mariana becomes wealthy and builds the water house. With her success, she becomes a matriarchal figure, symbolizing a new Africa. End quote. This is how the book is described on the jacket to sell it to readers. The novel begins in a small town called Piau, where a young girl of about 7 or 8 is anticipating a journey with her family. Her family consists of herself, her mother Epifania, her grandmother Caterina, who later reclaims her original name, Aina, and Mariana's younger brother and sister. The family is preparing for a journey back to Abeba, West Africa, and where the grandmother had originally come from. And the grandmother, Aina, had lived in Brazil for most of her life. As a young girl of 18 years old, she traveled with an uncle to Lagos, and I put uncle in quotes. And when she got to Lagos, she discovered that this was no ordinary excursion. The uncle had made arrangements to sell her into slavery. From there, she found herself the property of merchants in Lagos. Then they sold her to Brazilian merchants, and she found herself on a slave ship. In the journey from Lagos to Brazil, she gets her period for the first time. She's raped for the first time by the quote unquote, the man who looked after the slaves. The ship arrives in Bahia, which was the political and economic capital of Brazil in the 19th century. And young Aina is sold by one merchant after another until she ends up as the property of one Silva, who assigns her to be a handmaid to his daughter, who's leaving for the tiny village of Piau. For 50 years, Aina in the novel tells us that she's been a slave in Piau. Finally, emancipation had come to Brazil, and she had the right to go wherever she wanted, and she wanted to return home. Getting from Piau to Lagos took several years. The family went from Piau to Juiz da Fora to Bahia, and finally to Lagos. And at every step in the journey, The family confronted challenges related to transportation, accommodation, and how would they find the money for the next leg of their journey. Aina was worried about how long things were taking, about how settled her daughter Epifania and her grandchildren were becoming at each stop. She had waited and wanted all her life to experience a return home. Each further wait for a boat, for a ship, for earnings from petty trading to accumulate was another deferral of her destiny. The novel explores all of these journeys and much more besides. There are all these complicated erotic scenes, complicated ideas about interracial sexuality. Let's just say that the novel is a truly typical of the luso-tropical fantasies of mid-century Brazilian intellectuals. Still, I encourage you to read it. The real waterhouse, of course, was constructed by Asan Rocha, and the building he constructed was named the Waterhouse because he operated an early waterworks business there, which is one of the only sources of potable water in the area. Olinto's book changes everything. Now it's Mariana's house. She's a wealthy merchant. The book is clearly a work of fiction, but it is also very clearly informed by the research he did with and on Romana da Conceição Martins and the Brazilian descendant community she introduced into in Lagos. The novel is a challenging blend of what Olinto imagined, what Ramona said, events that historically happened to people like the real life Aina and the ancestors of the people Olinto met in Lagos. I'm still doing research on the book that is and its life and how people responded to it. But I find the novel useful for expanding my imagination about where histories can be recorded, where histories are recorded. In fictional stories, like The Waterhouse, in poems, perhaps, in various kinds of creative works that sought to leave an intentional record of what had happened in a particular place and time. I'm wrapping up now. I presented you guys with several types of records: an obituary, some journalistic reports, some photographs, the letter of a Catholic missionary, the transcripts of an oral interview, and a novel. They differ in form, they differ in their concerns, in their contents, in their emphasis, in how much they zoomed out in the big picture and in how much they zoomed in to individual stories and individual lives. They even differ in their details. Was it 1899 that the ship disembarked, or was it 1900? Even with their differences, I've tried to show how they still intersect around the history of migrations to Lagos, around Romana's journey even, and around the journey of the real grandma Aina's return. I've also tried to highlight the provenance of these records, meaning how they were created and where they were found. We have Brazilian diplomats, European missionaries, unknown photographers, an African-American scholar, who were all creators and collectors of these records on Lagos. To be sure, Romana gave her testimony as well, and journalists in Lagos reported on what was happening in the town. But one knows that the records in Lagos on Lagos are a lot richer than what is reflected here. What stories or memories did Romana leave her own relatives? What objects did she keep from the early part of her life? Where are the documents that liberated the real Aina and enabled her to travel with her family from Brazil to Lagos? What happened to the quarantine officers' reports? What was in the boxes that were confiscated due to the contamination of the ship? These records of migration were all created, but how were they preserved? We know that there were thousands of Romanas and thousands of real life Ainas from Brazil and other regions of Americas and from other regions of West Africa who landed in Lagos in the 19th century. Their records are all around us, I insist, if we know how to look. I want to close now with a call to action that inspired me to create the ecopolitanproject.org. Some of you might have seen it, and it's being worked on, and I would encourage you to visit it again. I launched this Ecopolitan .org 8 years ago with the goal of crowdsourcing for Lagos family histories through the internet. It has been a challenge, but I remain convinced that the richest records on Lagos's 19th century history are to be found in Lagos itself. The ask or the challenge that I want to close this talk with is that we should critically examine our lives with new lenses and think about what around us is a record of the migration to Lagos that happened in the 19th century. It could be a song that you were taught snatches of. It could be a recipe, a notebook, a photograph, the family lore that you have heard 1,000 times from your elders. It could be an heirloom that was passed down through the ages, a disintegrating Bible or Quran. It could be a document like a passport, freedom papers, a bill, a receipt, an identity document, baptism records, wedding announcement, a ship's manifest. It could be a song, a lullaby, an incantation, maybe a peculiar dance, a proverb, even an uncommon insult whose translation doesn't really make sense when you think about it in Lagos. Each of these things can be a record of a history of migration, contact with another place. Opening ourselves up to recognizing the records around us enables Lagosians to be more involved with the work of creating and preserving records on Lagos history. And of course, selfishly, it greatly assists the work of researchers like me who are committed to grounding Lagos history in Lagos records. I invite you all, whenever you get a chance, to visit the Ecopolitan Project abroad, to share it with others, and to join the conversation about how we can build a culture of historical curiosity and record keeping right here in Lagos. Thank you very much.
Okay, wow. Is everybody feeling as moved as I am? I mean, what a stunning, stunning story. Thank you so much. Jude, we're writing this, right? Good, okay. I have a few comments that I made, and I'd like to talk about those first, and then I'm going to open it up, but I can see the questions, okay? So I think it's interesting, and it's not something I have actively thought about, but it's a very female story. Okay, and when you think, or at least when I think of emancipados, my ancestor was a man, and you just tend to somehow think it may have been the men who, having been enslaved, freed, were the ones who were able to work and get the money to come back. But this is a story that obviously it was a female line. So between the mother and the grandmother, they were able to raise the funds. Is that usual?
I think we're probably a few years away from knowing what was usual in that experience, because we would need almost like a census of 19th century returns to see what was more likely. Look at myself.
No, because of the lights, so they can see you properly there. Yeah.
Can you see me?
Yeah. Okay.
No amount of light. Okay. I think that it's part of why we have when we think of the retornado or the emancipado, we think of men, is because there are so many famous men rather, who became known to us through Lagos history. And we don't really hear as much about, let's say, their wives, their daughters, or their mothers. We don't know. I think it just has to do with a kind of bias in the way we think about historical actors.
Okay. Yeah.
Oh, this is the perfect lighting for me. I think also that some of the records that some of the more prominent men left behind are very visible to us. Things like this beautiful house, or businesses, or monuments, right? Physical monuments. Several years ago, I was in Lagos. I was born in Lagos, but I didn't grow up here. So several years ago, I first discovered the Easter dish of Feijão, which I'd heard about, but I'd never seen it and I never tasted it. And it occurred to me, it was very nice, I loved it. And it occurred to me that if you're not in Lagos at a particular point in time, you would never see that record because it's only made at a particular point in time. If you came the week before Easter or the week after, you would not know about this dish, which is itself a record of migration. These are maybe when you can contrast a recipe to a monument, right? Some are more visible, some records are more visible than others, but all these records are here. Some records are more associated with male creators, but a dish that is cooked for hours, for a week in the middle of Easter is probably more associated with female creators. So I think our records might have some kind of biases, but as researchers, if we're aware of that, we don't have to be captive to the bias. We can really just kind of think around it and say, well, okay, given
You don't have to tell me that. I don't know why you think you have to tell me that. Well, there's only one way to talk to you. It's like communicating.
It's like they're killing each other.
And she
Hang
has
on.
an island in the Caribbean. Well done. The name of the island.
No. What you just mentioned, you were saying that exactly. You were saying that no woman is standing
You
up.
don't
The
even
woman has an opportunity.
I say no woman
She
is
messed it all
standing up. You
She
people
messed
are
it all
talking.
up. The only person I know is a woman.
Do you know today?
That's the only woman. The only woman. The only woman is
Who did
they
what?
killed her.
Nobody killed her. She had cancer.
No, they killed her. Come on, please don't tell me cancer. They killed her.
Yeah.
She was heard of. She was heard of under.
Cancer
She
is
went.
Okay. Okay, so I'm not sure if that's a real person or like somebody trying to hijack us exactly. So, but we shall continue.
nothing happens. I think they were debating Lagos history.
Okay.
So that's what I think. That's one way I think that the sources shape our understanding of history. But we can also be aware of how those biases can enter and be conscious of getting around those biases.
Thank you. The other comments that occurred to me while you spoke was when you mentioned Lagos was a small place. Okay, so I think it was in 1910, the British did a census and there were 20,000 people in Lagos, out of which 2,000 were descended from Brazilian descendants. So it was a small place. So you can imagine that with 2,000 people, 70 being ill, I guess they would have just imagined that it would just have spread through. I mean, I'm just saying this to, swings and roundabouts. And then for those of us who are on Lagos Island, and you think that of Ikoyi as a different island, of course, it was all the same island. And McGregor's canal is what he dug to separate Lagos Island, where the indigenous are, from Ikoyi, which is where the expatriates at that time were. So that was part of his health issues. The other comments I have was that.
Okay, that's a great question. That's a great question and fundamental to migration. All of us, I had to get visa papers to go to Brazil, so I know it was a process. And what I've seen is that in the mid-19th century, 1850s, 1860s, that if you were a freed person in Brazil, and this is during the period, I want to remember like the name of the governor, but there was a short period when the British state was kind of sponsoring ships to bring people from Brazil to Lagos for free. And so you would travel under as a British protected person under the British flag of British documents. And this was part of a short-lived campaign to try and create a new constituency for the British state, and also to try and they were trying to create like an agricultural scheme in Lagos. They were trying to get a kind of agricultural scheme going in Lagos, and they thought that, you know, freed people from Brazil who had worked in agriculture would be a natural constituency to bring. The scheme didn't really turn out to be that successful, and they abandoned it after a couple of years. But I would say that at least in that period, that was one way to get documents, one way to get kind of passports and passage. Later periods, I've also seen kind of Brazilian travel documents from the 1880s, 1870s, and they don't look exactly like the kind of passports we have today, but they're identity documents. They have your name, they have like where you're going, which they would just put Costa de Africa. And they would have like who's traveling with you, if there were children traveling with you, or if you were traveling with, you know, a spouse or something. They would list that person. They would try to have some kind of like physical description of you. And then they would have for Black migrants your status, like if you were someone a freed person, like a liberto, or if you were already like kind of born free, they would have those kinds of statuses. So there were these identity documents associated with travel. What?
Colorism as well.
Oh yeah, so that's part of describing bodily, like, you know, are you mixed like this? Are you dark like this? You know, they had all these categories. So they had those kinds of documents, and I'm not sure at this point, this is a really good question, whether you needed a kind of visa to go between the Brazilian Empire and the British Empire, right? The documents I was interested in are like your free papers and your passage papers, like your kind of right to travel, permit to travel papers. But what the process was of getting permission to travel from one empire to the other at that point in time, I still want to look into it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we're going to start with the questions. Do we have questions here? Come put up our hands. If not, I'll go straight
or contributions.
Or contributions or comments. If not, I'll go to online because they are hot and ready. Okay, we have the gentleman in the back, and then this lady. Let me.
So doing the research on Romana, did you come across, let's say, potential father? Because at some point it goes back to Brazil, so were there any connection with the father's family?
Of course, there was a father, but he's not in. The only record in which I have seen the father of our central character, Romana, being discussed is in Antonio Olinto's novel, right, where he talks about Mariana's paternity. And it's a very violent scene of how Mariana comes to be conceived. Okay, so is that something that Romana related to him, that he is fictionalized? Is that part of his imagination of what, you know, Afro-Brazilian relationships were like? Is that, you know, what is that scene reflecting? So that is the only place I have seen the direct reference to the father in this family, is in the fictional source. So what does one do with that? You know?
To lead on from that question, which I think is good, have you seen the exit documents of Romana and her mother and the grandmother? And because of the colorism that we just spoke about, were they all? I mean, the grandmother presumably was not mixed, but if the mother was, and she herself was, that might give a different lens to the story.
Absolutely. I'm looking for all the records I can find on Romana de Conceição, honestly. I haven't seen her identity documents or those of her mother and her grandmother yet. I hope I'll run into them one day. And it can totally happen. I mean, the letter that I was referencing from Reverend Lang that I got in Ireland, I got that many years ago. And it was only recently, as I was like really thinking about, you know, once I had the name of the ship, the Alianza, then I was able to start researching the ship, and then new things started popping up. It was only recently that I was like rereading that letter, and I was like, is this the same ship? Because he didn't name it at all. So records come to you at various points in time, and you know, it's through reading all of them that you start to triangulate things, and you know, hopefully the records of their identity documents will come to me, and I'll be able to answer your question.
Okay. The lady.
Thanks for reading the message. I think you actually just kind of asked because that's amazing.
Can you speak up so that online?
No, I was saying just a question of how we find these little fragments, and in particular the SMA one was one that struck. How it's not going to say where to go. So it's like how do you sort of make that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's the thing about like this historical research. Some of it is serendipity, you know. The name of the ship I only discovered, you know, this year, 2022. So that like just having a name opens up so much, you know. And the serendipity factor can be beautiful, but it also can make research endless because it's like, oh, if I just wait, the source will come to me, you know, but it doesn't work like that.
We have a question online. When is it about the vote? There, you can see it.
I can also see it here.
Yeah.
Documents, photos, book. Can we have access to the record and the books? Absolutely. Once the book is done, I will absolutely be donating some copies to the library at Oniko House.
And coming here for your lunch?
Absolutely. Cannot miss a lunch in Lagos. Hello.
Okay. Okay, we have a question here. So, can you speak up?
The obituary talks about names. I couldn't see the camera, but there's an obituary that shows the baby, children, great grandchildren, grandchildren, family. Obviously, those names are just repeated, but there was a name there that people may know. So that tells me some more about our family. They must be alive, but now have great grandchildren alive. Then of course the photograph of the baby. Well, looking at it from what I see, that was right. Instead. Then the second thing is the issue of going back home. My grandmother likes to yeah. She was taking up 18 to church. Go there. For her now, Romana, she was born in Brazil. She came about 8 or 9. So she's grown up in our country. So it's just like that's the reason for immigrants. Immigrants, sisters, like Nigerian, Charles, Canadian, so it's the same sort of thing that I think happens to Romana.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I myself have been a migrant in my life. And so I feel what you're saying, that there's a way in which like having the experience helps you to ask questions about the historical experience, right? So like you said, Romana made that curious comment about, oh, I thought never in my life would I see my land and my people again. And it's like, which one is your land and your people? And so, so absolutely that there is our understanding of migration trends historically can help us to ask questions about a particular period. But each period is also very different. It's very, very different to be a Black and Brazilian in the 19th century, let's say pre the Golden Law, right? Because if you're a Black and Brazilian, and let's say you're not a liberto, right? And let's say, or so half of your family that's enslaved and half of them are free. You know, to me, one of the things I argue is that being Brazilian, if you were Black in that country, is not to be taken for granted. It's not a given, it's a question. We call them Brazilians, but maybe they only became Brazilian once they left and they ended up here, right? So, but then in the 20th century, you have a national identity. You're Brazilian in a totally different way than your ancestors before. So yeah, there are these trans-historical similarities or questions that we can expect about migration in all ages and places. But then there's also the particularity of place and time that plays a role as well.
Yes.
Thank you so much for this very fascinating presentation aspect of the process. I was particularly interested in the point you made, about fiction or faction in literature as a veritable, source. I just wanted to call your attention to Ishara by Wole Soyinka. Ishara by Wole Soyinka. There's this grand Brazilian family in that book, which is interesting. Ishara.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm definitely going to look that up as soon as I get home.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks a lot for your presentation. I'm just going to talk about or ask you about the place of language in migration, because we see people come from Brazil and it's Portuguese and then because like words like English, which is hard. How do they what the completeness of all of that language made opportunities progress in Lagos society at that time? Then my second part will be about religion. In Brazil, we know about Santeria and how the slaves were held on to their traditional religion, but modeled it after Christianity so that they could fly under the radar of the Portuguese. When they had to make the journey back, what happened to, because we don't see Santeria practice here, they just come back and say, oh, we're coming back to real things, just dump whatever innovations we had behind and all of that. So then the third one will be what is the heritage or influence of these returnees that is still existing up to this very present moment in Lagos. And is there anything in Brazil that, because I think you were saying she was romanticizing going back, so some of them might have. If they did, was there anything they took from here that is still existing?
Such great questions and so many questions. Okay. But I'll start with the question on language and religion. I think those are very interesting questions. Probably not in the 1850s and 60s, but definitely by the 70s and 80s. English is becoming it's a language of power in Lagos, right? And facility with it will have an impact on your access to power. So we often see in histories of 19th century Lagos some differentiations made, because as I told you, I'm talking about emancipados today, but it was a much more complex community of migrants. Differentiations made between Saro and Brazilians, or people who are coming from, outside of Lagos, like, from Oyo Empire down towards the coast, etc. And those differentiations are not just cultural, but they're also linguistic. It's not that, Saros didn't know how to build. They didn't have didn't have facility with building trades, and it was only a Brazilian thing. And it's not that there weren't Brazilians who could have been clerks and, priests or whatever, and traders, but they had different levels of facility with the language of power. And I think that plays a role in kind of where they get concentrated in the economy and society of Lagos. So, yeah, I think that for that first generation that did not come in with any facility with English, they probably were, what we call self-employed, and they would have had to be insulated within their own communities in order to survive, and only maybe gradually with their second generations would they start to gain more facility with the broader community. Now, this is a very interesting question about religion And if when in Brazil, there was a greater adherence to African religions, why do we see that in West Africa, there seemed to be a lesser adherence to West African religions by this same community? I'm not sure that really there was a lesser adherence. You know, in the Catholic missionary records, they complained about people being, let's say, undisciplined in their Catholicism. And they complain about, people still kind of practicing both, right? A lot of the Brazilian returnees, contrary to popular belief, were Muslim and not really Catholic or at all. And so that is a kind of under-researched dimension of this history. And so if you go to Shita Mosque, like all that was set up by Brazilian communities. And, I think that one other thing that I want to say about religion, which is not exactly answering what you're saying, but I mentioned pilgrims because there's been scholarship on some Afro-Brazilians coming to West Africa on pilgrimage, right? On pilgrimages to visit shrines, to visit, heads of their candomblés, etc. So coming to West Africa for religious purposes, right? To get more religious power that they could, spiritual power that they could then take back with them to Brazil. So religion plays a role also in that migration. Like it's not only that people are coming to settle, people are coming to trade, people are coming for spiritual reasons. That's another, it's not exactly what you're asking, but West Africa in the 19th century is still is for those who practice syncretic or African religions in Brazil, a place that you go to get a little more spiritual power and continue that. I see a hand. The other questions I will happy to talk about there.
Okay. Just before you take that one, I wanted to recall, and I think it's something that is often hidden because if you know about the Mali rebellion in Brazil, it was when the enslaved people, mostly of Yoruba extraction, rose up against the Portuguese. But it's interesting, the name, because it's not something that we often talk about.
Yes, it is interesting, the name, and that rebellion is often cited as the origin of the kind of mass movement of returnees. To say mass is not the kind of numbers that we would think about in the 21st century or in our time, but in the hundreds, right? So that was a mass movement back then, and it all stemmed really from this rebellion. That was an uprising in Bahia that was led by both enslaved people, but also free people, right? Like, so free Blacks in Brazil who were under various kinds of racial oppression in solidarity with each other. And yes, and a lot of them were Muslim. And that, I think, it's interesting to think that Himalayan rebellion, also called the kind of Muslim uprising in Bahia, is somehow kind of separated, right, from our understanding of retornados once they arrive.
Yeah.
So there are all these artificial breaks in the way we understand the history that I think that I want to work against, and that I want to kind of that I want to work against in my own life. Okay.
There was a question over here.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dr. George, for your really amazing presentation. I had two questions. One related to the idea of home. And I think one of the really interesting things you raised during migration is that people are looking for a home, right? The family went through so much to come to Lagos. And even here, they say at the end that she was longing to go back to the actual. And I wondered, do you have any information about her experiences in Lagos with other Yoruba people, other returnees from Cuba or wherever? And do you have anything to sort of let them
And if we're export loving Lagos, how does that complicate our engagement with fish, right? What happens when we find things that are fishes or difficult or really challenging? So I wonder what your reflections on that are, those are strange and
Wow.
Yeah.
This is one of my colleagues, Dr. Ademi from University of California, and she's also the founder of the new maps of old Lagos blog. You should all check out.
Oh yes.
A brilliant historical geography project recreating all the empty maps of Lagos. So, where is home? What is home? What is the meaning of home? That is a deep question. I mean, I think that is maybe the question that unconsciously animates this project, right? Like, is it a question for Romana and these returnees, or is it a question for myself? How do the two layers intersect, and how can they be distinguished from each other so that I can clearly perceive the particularity of their history and their time, and not muddy it with something else? You know, isn't home always imperfect, no matter where it is? I mean, the fact that Olinto recorded these words from Romana could be an expression of her deep felt saudades for Brazil. But wasn't he a Brazilian politician? It could be a reflection of him trying to big up Brazil. Everybody loves Brazil, even those who have left 50, 60 years ago, right? There's definitely some political work, what we call soft power work, that is happening when you have this elderly African woman touring Brazilian cities in the 1960s, talking to the media, meeting politicians, telling everyone how much she misses and loves Brazil. Because Brazil in the 1960s, you know, they had a Black nationalist movement that was challenging the state. You know, they had Afro-Brazilians who were pushing against the Luso-tropicalist myth of a multiracial utopia in Brazil. So they had some political challenges that they had to deal with. And definitely this African woman coming and saying that I love Brazil, unlike these troublemakers here, does some political work for them. So, you know, yeah.
That's actually very interesting of looking at it as well. And I think what you've done, at least for me, is to be able to try and look at things from both sides, not just, and I guess that's what historians do. You have to look at the whole context of
All sides.
all sides. Over here. Any questions here? Any questions here? Yes. Okay.
I was going to say, there's one question up there in Romana, but I can't reconnect with her family in Nigeria. Come in like through her grandmother.
Yes. Once again, that's such a great question. Once again, the reference to what the real Aina found when she came back to Nigeria appears in the novel. And in the novel, as soon as they land in Lagos and they get settled, she takes her family to a Bepta on a day trip with her. They go to the place where she remembered her home being, and it's no longer there, and there's nobody there that knows her. Right, so it's a kind of tragic non-return again. So yeah, that's the one account of that. But it's in the novel.
But it's in the novel, right?
It's in the novel, yeah.
So did she get married? Romana? Did she have children?
Yeah, Romana got married to someone named Martins. So later in her life, when she dies as Romana Martins. And she has children and she has grandchildren. And I've been trying to reach out to them to see, well, what do you know about Romana's return? So the project continues, and
yes, you had a question.
So first of all, my name is Romana.
I don't know who it was.
And the power behind the throne.
It's a project of passion rather than commerce. And I'd like to talk about your what you also got into this because there was a gap.
Do you want to use the mic?
Thank you. We got into this because we realized that there was a gap in information, especially for the younger people, younger Nigerians, and younger Lagosians.
You know what? Because I'm Muslim. Why don't you come so people online can see you?
Thank you. Yes, we got into this because we realized that there was a gap in information, and we thought that, and even we lived all our lives in Lagos, and we still didn't know so much about the city itself, its history and culture. And it becomes even mixed for you that you're adult to understand and to put everything in perspective. So we thought, okay, let's do this. One of the shocks we got was that if you look at the pictures behind it that has, now this house tells you the Saro history, Victorian history. If you look at the pictures behind you, when we bring young people here, they tell us that, yes, they've heard these names before, but they thought they were white, that they were Europeans. And that starts to show you how there's a huge gap in information. And for me, and for my wife as well, we looked at it and we're like, okay, so there's so many things going on now. You've got art, you've got fashion, and they're all heading in different directions. And I just thought, wouldn't it be nice to tie that off with these young Nigerians, with their history, with their culture, such that it wouldn't just be like something that just happens out of the blues. There will be something deliberate that is driving them, which is why we think this is important. Lagos history is important to Nigeria, just as Nigeria's history is important to Lagos. So we thought, like, this is the one we know. Let's start with this. Now, you and I, yesterday when we were doing the rehearsal, we touched on something. Now, what usually happens is that when we take people through this room, by the time we get to that corner, people start to ask us, are you saying that there are no women that participated in the development of Lagos? Fortunately, we have a lady around the corner, I don't want to put in a rural. But beyond that, I mean, you do this tour and you're like, okay, so what's the future? We know the past now, we have an idea of the past, what's the future? And we're hoping that this would be the bridge whereby you're like, this is where we started from, this is the culture, this is the history, and this is what it's leading to. So when you're in fashion, if you're in art, wherever you're at, you're able to tie it to the history of the place itself. And I'd like to now ask you, I know you've had a bit of time, and I'll give you a bit of time to digest that. When you said, so how do we now make all of this work for the future? I don't know if it's something that you want to make a bit of. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that question and for creating this institution. I mean, I think that places like Loving Lagos and like LASRA, like the Lagos Studies Association, there are all kinds of institutions that are being created in Lagos, to really allow us to think critically about ourselves, to focus on ourselves, to focus on our history, to focus on where we've been and what we're trying to do collectively. And I think that the primary thing we should be doing is to really support those institutions, to strengthen them. We're quick to strengthen commercial institutions, to strengthen political institutions. And I think that if we dedicate that same kind of energy to our cultural institutions, that we won't really have this kind of shocking gap in knowledge that inspired you in a years-long fever to, to kind of rebuild this house, right? To recreate the house that the Holloways lived in, and to kind of recreate what a 19th century home was like. One of the things we were talking about yesterday was, some of you can walk through the house. It's also a museum and there's a library on the top floor. It's beautiful. And one of the things I did a tour, and Okwaya, beautiful Okwaya here, took me on this tour. And one of the things we were talking about was the fact that the rooms in this house are not so huge, right? They're not so big, but they're not too small. But the windows are huge, and the windows face each other. So it's interesting to think that historically, maybe 100 years ago or more, the way we built was with smaller rooms and bigger windows. So the emphasis was on air and light. Now we build in the opposite way, with big rooms and the smaller windows, right? And it could be that our security system has, our security situation in Lagos has completely changed, such that we are now barricaded and closed in our houses, no air and no light. But it's something to be aware that Lagos was different and maybe could be different in the future, right? That are we always going to live in the way that we do? Do we have to? Can we imagine living otherwise? So things like that, that's, you know, an institution like this that you can walk into and experience the past. It's a cultural institution. I hope that Loving Lagos will bring many visitors, many generous philanthropic donors, and will be a sustainable and even profitable institution that will breed other institutions beyond itself. But what it is a cultural institution. It is a resource for everyone in Lagos. It is one that we have to intentionally and actively invest in, as we do in all our cultures.
I'd just like to also add another little plug for Loving Lagos. Just down the road from here on Catholic Mission Street, they have the Afro-Brazilian Cultural Center, which is a collaboration with the Brazilian Descendants Association, and there's a small mini museum there for those of us who are interested in learning more about the Afro-Brazilian history. Do we have any other questions? If not, online, do we? No. So, yes?
I don't have a copy of the book yet, but I'm working on it there.
I'm talking about
Oh, Making Modern Girls.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do have an earlier book, Making Modern Girls. I don't have a copy on here today, but it is available on Amazon. And if you'd like a copy, I will get one to you. But I want to thank everybody for coming who is in the house tonight, in Onikon House. And I really want to thank the Adams, Lawan, and Sisi for hosting us. I really want to thank Ms. Aduke Gomez for inviting me to be part of the illustrious lineup of Loving Lagos speakers. And for everybody online for logging in, thank you so much for your participation. Appreciate it.
I think Professor George has done my thank you speech. So, so thank you. Can we give her a round of applause? Because I think it was thank you so much. I have had a good time, and I think